Hi, everybody. My name is Mishra-Newbery. I am the Interim Executive Director for Women's March Global, and today I am really excited to be able to share with you our last webinar in our mini course for the law and sexual violence. Every week this month in March, we have been partnering with Equality Now and their incredible network to talk about the law and sexual violence and rape consent laws around the world. We are doing this because we are in the middle of 5 months of action to end violence against women. As many of you know, we started in January 2019 this year with our Women's Wave Anniversary March, and the focus there was ending violence against women. We put together a toolkit that listed all of the ways in which women experience violence, and the statistics were staggering, and they still continue to be. We are in conversation with Equality Now to not only learn about the incredible work that they are doing, but also to learn from them about how the law impedes in many ways access for justice or access to justice for women, and what they are doing to help really put in and work with politicians and people in country so that they can help to change those laws so that women can actually have access to justice when it comes to sexual violence. So today I have the honor of having 2 people on the call with me. If you have any questions for myself or our guest, please leave them in the chat box on Facebook, and we will definitely get to them. Alternatively, you can also email us at community@womensmarchglobal.org, and we will be happy to transmit your questions to the Equality Now team as well, if you are watching this after our live session is over. A quick reminder that this is our last webinar in this mini course for the law and sexual violence. And if you are interested in learning more about the work that Equality Now is doing, we're going to be adding a link into our Facebook Live chat so that you can follow them on Facebook and Twitter and continue to follow their good work. So with that, I'm going to introduce first Judy from Equality Now. And Judy's going to be talking to us about sexual violence in Kenya. Before you start with that, Judy, I would love for you to talk about the work that you are doing with Equality Now and some of the things that you are seeing on the ground.
Great. Thanks, Uma. I work with Equality Now as its Africa coordinator, and we work across different countries in Africa. And our work is, of course, for justice for women and girls across the continent. We address 4 key issues. We work towards ending sexual violence. We work towards ending sex trafficking. We also work towards ending harmful practices, specifically child marriage and FGM, that's female genital mutilation. And we also work towards legal equality, that's challenging laws that are discriminatory against women and girls. And so we do this through different ways. We challenge the law, we go to court, we seek legal reform. We work in collaboration with partners across the different countries who have authenticities in the different communities, so that they in turn can change the context and change the values in the specific communities that they work in. And we work through advocacy, which is largely amplifying the voices of the women and girls who traditionally are the victims, to ensure their voices are heard in different spaces. And so we do this through across different countries all across Africa. Yes, sorry.
No, that's okay. So what I would love, in this entire month, what we've been really discovering, and I think even for me, what's been incredible to learn is, one, the statistics for sexual violence around the world, but then also how the laws are actually impeding in a lot of ways access to justice for women. So if you could give us an overview on sexual violence in Kenya and what that really, all of the details that you have at your fingertips, that would be fantastic.
Right. So sexual violence is quite prevalent in Kenya. The Equality Now Africa office runs out of Nairobi. And so, speaking on the Kenyan context, our data and health survey, a national document no less, indicates that 43% of women and girls between the ages of 15 and 49 have reported being violated, having suffered gender-based violence in one form or another. Now, that is a high percentage on any account. And to think that these are the ones that have actually been reported, and in these instances, such violations are hardly reported, bearing in mind cultural values and norms with regards to matters to do with sexuality or sexual violence. And so with that kind of number, I mean, the ranges of women and girls who are violated varies. We have little children, some as young as 11 months, 12 months, a year-old children being violated, all the way to grandmothers. Last month, there was a recording of a woman who was 83, who was sexually violated. And so the violations are gruesome and they're grievous, and they range across a broad spectrum of ages. Now, the sad reality, Uma, is that this is happening despite Kenya having a robust legal framework. We've got quite a comprehensive, I'll start with the constitution of the country, which provides that one has a right, of course, to personal integrity and integrity of the person, and moving along to a Sexual Offences Act, which prohibits everything from rape to defilement to sexual assault and even sexual harassment. And so we do have a comprehensive law in that regard. We even have a law that provides protections for victims of domestic violence, and even, for example, provides a definition and a prohibition of marital rape. And so our laws are quite advanced. We have a Children's Act that actually provides for children to be protected from such violations. We have an Anti-FGM Act, which provides for harmful practices against women and girls. And so it's not for lack of a law, even though these laws do have some gaps, but it's not for lack of an existence of a comprehensive legal framework. The challenge really lies in the implementation of these laws. And so there is a huge failure on the part of the state and duty bearers to implement the existing legal framework. If you'll allow me then, some of the challenges that have caused the law not to be implemented properly include attitudes and practices that people bring, especially duty bearers, that bring to the implementation of the law, so that when you find a woman or a girl reporting a case of sexual violence, then it is viewed as a non-issue. If I may use again a quick example, in 2007, Kenya had an internal conflict related to the election, and there was banning of houses and raping of women and girls and looting of property. And when women would want to report incidences of sexual violence alongside other incidences, they were asked to choose whether or not they want to report about sexual violence or the burning of the house. So make a choice, really. And so issues to do with sexual violence are not given preference or not addressed comprehensively as a result of attitudes and practices. And these have trickled down even into financing, so that we have guidelines, national guidelines and policies with regards to coordination of the different duty bearers, from investigations to prosecution. But there is no adequate financing for these, both human resource and infrastructure, and just general proper support by state of these institutions to ensure investigation and prosecution is properly done. And so just what we are doing as an organization in response to this is we've taken what we refer to as a multi-sectoral approach. Now, just to quickly run through that, it's not what we traditionally understand and saying multi-sectoral, and so everybody come to the table and do your role. No, it's what we call a 5-pillar platform. And so the first is we identify a specific issue, and in this case, it's sexual violence. And we approach the state and ensure that the state takes this as a priority issue, whether to declare it a national disaster or a national emergency, but to make it a priority issue. The second step is to ensure then that the government aligns all of its departments, including the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Gender, all of the different departments, to align behind this national issue, so that if it's finance, then they will finance the specific departments that they need to do that. If it's a Ministry of Health, then there's necessary human resource that isn't necessarily equipped to provide the care and the shelter to women and girls. And so and then once the alignment has been done, we ask that a specific department is tasked with the responsibility to coordinate, monitor, and implement the activities of all of the other departments. And it's got to be a department or a ministry that has clout, and not the way they usually relegate it to the Ministry of Gender and then not necessarily fund it and say it's a women's affair. No, so that we have a department that actually regulates and oversees the work of the other department. The fourth pillar is one of technical support or expertise, and we lend that pillar by lending expertise on matters gender, legal reform, legal understanding, and policy to the state, so that they then in turn have the capacity, and we can build capacity of the necessary actors. And then the final gender has the final platform is to do with civil society, which brings civil society actors to the table to hold the state to account, to ensure that they do their duty. Development partners can come in and fund where there are shortfalls. And so we've taken this approach and presented it to the state, and are beginning to build the necessary capacities to ensure that, one, sexual violence becomes a priority. Two, in this regard, we've identified the State Department Gender to be the coordinating actor, to coordinate the other departments. Three, to ensure that there's necessary alignment, including financing on matters to do with gender. And then we then provide the technical competencies and capacities that they require to build them. And then we are working with women, grassroots organizations, women groups, and partners on the ground to hold the state accountable at the different locations and platforms that they have.
So I want to ask you, Judy, you brought up in the drivers, and what, again, I know that many people are learning so much through this mini course, and I am one of those people. And one of the things that you said at the very beginning struck me, that 45% of women and girls have experienced violence in Kenya, despite there being this robust legal framework. And I want to ask you here, you brought up the fact that there are three drivers to violence: the knowledge gaps, the attitudes and practices, and then the failure to enforce the laws. Do you see one of them being more so contributing to that systemic violence, or do you see them all working kind of in conjunction with each other?
I think they're working in conjunction with each other, because you see, where you have a prosecutor, for example, and in one of our pathways, I'll explain briefly. You'd find a prosecutor who has all the capacity, has the necessary legal framework to pursue a particular case, would dismiss a case of sexual violence on account of his own inhibitions, informed by his own attitude towards women or towards, the specific case. And so they bring their judgment to the case and don't give the case a chance. And you see, in such instances, we've identified, a quick example is in an area called Busia in Kenya. There was a girl who was gang raped. The group of boys or men who had done the violation were known. And so when she finally managed to report this to the local administration, he simply asked the boys to slash grass and released them in the compound of the administrator as a means of punishment, because for him such a violation was minor. And therefore, that was what it is he thought could be done. And so we pursued the matter, including with the Director of Public Prosecutions here in Nairobi, and had the matter addressed. So in that instance, you see, it's got nothing to do with the legal framework. The girl, against all odds, actually spoke to the administrator and reported the incident. And it was a gruesome violation, to say the least. She needed therapy to walk. It was quite heinous. And so that she reported the incident, that she knew the perpetrators, that they were apprehended in good time, but they were asked to slash grass, just shows you that the attitudes and practices that are taking place, perhaps not necessarily in Nairobi, but in rural Kenya. And so I need to unlearn some of these things in order to enable the law to be implemented in the manner in which it prescribes punishment for such incidences. And so in such instances, we take up what we call strategic litigation and identify the systemic issue and choose, for example, to even prosecute a prosecutor who fails to do that, or the legal administrator who fails to do his duty, in order for everybody to understand that should you be a hindrance to justice, then justice will be carried out against you. And so it's a mix, Uma. It really is.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Judy, in terms of the situation in Kenya. And also for sharing with us the multi-sectoral approach that Equality Now is taking to address this very, very real issue. I want to now turn to Tamar, and now moving to Georgia. Tamar, one, please introduce yourself and talk about the work that you are doing with Equality Now, but then after that, if you can again provide this report on, or the map, so to speak, on what is happening in Georgia in regards to sexual violence, that would be great.
Thanks so much, Uma. I started working for Equality Now a year ago. I'm from Tbilisi, Georgia, and I'm based in Tbilisi, Georgia. And my duty is to work on the priority areas of Equality Now in Eurasia, which basically covers 15 countries of the former Soviet Union. And our priority area in the region is fighting sexual violence. We chose this topic because some states in the region have made certain improvements in various areas of violence against women, but sexual violence has been systematically overlooked by each and every state. It has been overlooked to the extent that in many of the countries of the region, there has been no conversation at all, even among local human rights groups when it comes to sexual violence, while other issues have been more or less addressed in some countries. For example, Georgia has a very active new wave of women's rights movement, which started in 2014. And since then, the movement has focused on a number of issues, starting from femicide, starting from and glass ceiling, domestic violence, and other human rights violations. But only this year, on March 8, 2019, the movement conducted the very first protest demonstration to focus on sexual violence. So yeah, I'm covering Eurasia, and I'm based in Tbilisi, Georgia.
Wow, thank you so much, Tamar. And it's, what's striking to me is that you said, one, that the women's rights movement in Georgia started, I think you said in 2014, but that sexual violence is just now being spoken about in 2019, 5 years later. Can you take us through some of the statistics that you find specifically to Georgia and the landscape when you're talking about sexual violence, and why it's been so difficult to even have this conversation?
Yeah, sexual violence is a very widespread women's rights violation in Georgia, and there's a very high level of impunity when it comes to punishing the perpetrators. With the study that came out in 2017, the National Study on Violence Against Women found that 26% of women in Georgia have experienced either sexual harassment or some form of sexual violence by persons outside their family. And of course, these violations also occur within the family too, by partners and husbands. And this statistics is just for outside the family. And despite this, the conviction rate for rape is really low. For example, in 2016, there have been only 13 people convicted for sexual violence. In 2017, only 5 people. And in 2018, only 8 people. So it means that less than 1% of perpetrators are brought to justice. Why the conversation has not been started on sexual violence so far is that there's a lot of stigma attached to women's sexuality, and women who experience sexual violence, or women who have sex outside marriage. There's a lot of traditional attitudes still pervasive in Georgia about women's virginity. So women who engage in any kind of sexual activity, whether it be consensual sex or even sexual violence, they are very reluctant to talk about it. They are very reluctant to take the cases to the police and report, because there's a lot of victim blaming going on, not only by law enforcement bodies, but also by the families of the victims and the communities at large. So women tend to report sexual violence very, very seldom. Even in those cases where sexual violence gets actually reported, it very seldom goes into official police records. For example, if a woman reports several forms of violence that she experienced, for example, physical violence, emotional violence, sexual violence, economic violence, the police often tends to take note of all forms of violence, but leaving out sexual violence. They are doing this because investigating sexual violence is more difficult than investigating other forms of violence against women, and they just do not want to have these complicated cases investigated. Therefore, the records that police has on sexual violence does not show exact statistics. And there's no specific methodology. The methodology on how to investigate sexual violence is very much lacking, which results in the lack of knowledge of the investigators and prosecutors in collecting evidence, interrogating the witnesses, and taking the approach which is not based on victim blaming and which cannot prevent, and which would approach that would be able to prevent secondary victimization of the survivors. There's a lot of secondary victimization when it comes to lengthy procedures of sexual violence and the attitudes of the police, prosecutors, and judges, and all other actors that are involved in the investigation and prosecution. So with Equality Now, we just last year started focusing on the region of Eurasia. And back then, there was almost no evidence which would show how existing laws and procedures are failing women who are survivors of sexual violence. And therefore, we drafted the report which compares which analyzes the 15 states of the former Soviet Union. It analyzes the laws and procedures in place that are used for investigation and prosecution, which ultimately deny justice for survivors of sexual violence.
In that report, Tamar, that covers the 15 countries, can you say what the trends are in a broad sense across the board?
The most problematic issue, which is common in most of the countries of the former Soviet Union, is that the burden of investigation and prosecution of sexual violence is the survivor bears the burden of investigating and prosecuting rather than the state. There's no mandatory investigation for sexual violence. The survivor has to file the complaint, the survivor has to collect the evidence, the survivor has to pay the costs of the medical examination. So all the burden is on the survivor rather than the state, as it should be. It's not true in Georgia, but it's true for most of the countries of Eurasia. And another very problematic issue is that the case is terminated if the victim and the perpetrator are reconciled, if the perpetrator reconciled with the victim. Reconciliations happen very often, but not because survivor actually wanted to reconcile with the perpetrator, but because the survivor is subjected to a lot of pressure by the police, by her family, by her relatives, by the perpetrator to reconcile. And these lengthy and very traumatizing procedures of sexual violence also encourage the survivor to drop the case. So these are two very, very important and the most serious barriers that are mandated by the law and that prevent access to justice for survivors. So now we are advocating at international human rights bodies and locally to for these states to amend their laws so that reconciliation is not allowed for sexual violence, and so that all forms of sexual violence are subjected to mandatory investigation and prosecution by the state, so that the state has a responsibility to bring perpetrators to justice rather than the survivor.
So, Judy, I want to turn this question then over to you. Tamar just said that you know, in terms of access to justice, so much of the burden of seeking justice is placed on the survivor. Yet in Kenya, what you had mentioned is that the laws are actually quite robust, but does the survivor still feel that intense burden? Do they still carry that intense burden in Kenya?
They do. They do. The nature of sexual violence is that it's quite devastating, and also it violates victims at a point of you know, where they're most vulnerable. And so the whole concept of, you know, a victim going for an evaluation, a medical evaluation, and then moving from the doctors to the police or vice versa, with the evidence, and then going back into a court system, because we have a common law system, and then being cross-examined while they're on the dock, explaining, being re-traumatized, if you will, explaining the details of how it is they were violated. I mean, it's quite a heavy burden. There are some provisions in the law that attempt to lighten the load. And there's a provision in the Sexual Offences Act, for example, for an intermediary who, if the victim is particularly vulnerable, for example, if a victim is a child or is in a state that they cannot speak for themselves, that the intermediary can attend court with the victim and provide assistance in the giving of the evidence. But then in most instances, if not all, there's a requirement for the victim to be in court and provide evidence of or for herself. The other sad reality is that, again, being a common law system, the case is only to the extent that it's proven. And with cases, again, of sexual violence, the proof is in forensics. And again, with minimal financing with regards to forensics, it means it's very difficult for the victim to make it in time to a hospital that actually has the relevant facilities to be able to capture the DNA and whatever else that is required for purposes of the court. There's, again, a chain of custody for that evidence to be kept safe, and then through the court processes and in time for the matter to be expedited in court, so that the evidence doesn't disintegrate, and all of these other issues that make it a very difficult case for the victim throughout the process. And so the law could be clear, but then it's the detail. The devil is in the implementation, so that to ensure a case is expedited, to ensure that all stops across the country are well equipped, well resourced for the victim to be able to do that, and in fact have a one-stop shop, if you will, where you have the police and the doctor in the same room as a best case scenario.
So I find it interesting, you know, over the past 4 weeks, what's been fantastic is that we've been able to really learn the landscape of sexual violence, the laws, and lack of, you know, the barriers to access of justice from Equality Now, and the extensive network that you all have really built. And, you know, one of the things I keep on coming back to, and Tamar, you brought this up, and Judy as well, you know, if we go back a couple of weeks to the conversation that we had with Suad for the MENA region, and how the fight there is to not have forced marriages, and you know, Tamar, you brought this up, you know, the pressure that the survivor feels sometimes to enter back into these relationships where they were harmed in the first place, you know, and Judy, even with laws that support survivors, the barriers that are still in place for women to actually experience justice. In your positions, you know, and I know that it's difficult perhaps to speak to this globally, what are the possible solutions that you see that are doable, that are achievable, especially because there seem to be so many barriers in place for women globally in this issue? Tamar, I'll start with you.
Yeah. In Eurasia, one of our first steps is opening the discussion about sexual violence, because as compared to many other parts of the world, there has been no discussion about sexual violence for many years here, and this issue is very much stigmatized. And the more stigmatized sexual violence and women's sexuality in general is, it's less likely that the survivors will report violence, and it's less likely that when survivors report sexual violence, they will receive justice rather than further stigmatization. So we are working with supporting local women's rights groups to raise the awareness of the issue. But at the same time, we are starting to do a procedures manual, which will be a guiding document for all actors involved in the investigation process, police, prosecutors, and judges, that will guide them throughout the stages of the investigation, so that there will be special requirements that they have to comply to prevent victimization, to prevent blaming, and to prevent placing burden on the survivor, and to investigate sexual violence in a way that results in justice for survivors. So, and another approach that we are taking about amending the laws is that we are submitting reports to international human rights bodies in order for these bodies to give the government's recommendations about amending the laws that deny justice for survivors. So based on their outcome document, their concluding observations, we together with the local groups will be advocating for legal change. So in this region, social attitudes, patriarchal attitudes is a huge issue, as well as the existing legislation, as well as the procedures in place that are in place to enforce the laws. At the moment, the laws in Georgia, at least, the laws do not provide a low standard. They are better than average if we compare with the situation of the other countries. But the existing practices do not even live up to the requirements of the law, existing procedures through which laws are implemented. So I think in Georgia, as well as in other parts of the world, the key issue is the implementation of the existing laws and improving the existing standards at the same time, while working on changing the perceptions on sexual violence, which is the most difficult thing to do.
Thank you so much, Tamar. And Judy, I want to pose the same question to you from your position in Kenya. What are some solutions that you see as feasible solutions to address this situation?
Well, 3 quick answers, and I'll start where Tamar stopped. And I think there needs to be a dialogue. There needs to be a community dialogue addressing the issue of sexual violence, but at the root. What are the drivers? Because we do understand, and as Tamar said, that it's a patriarchal issue. Sexual violence has nothing to do with sex. It's about power and power play. And so to begin addressing these issues, I like an analogy that people think that rights are 10 balls in a bucket, and that if women take 6, then there are only 4 for the rest of the world to fight over. So I need to understand that everybody has rights inherently because you're human beings, and because if I cannot take your rights from you. If you're alive, I'm also alive. And so everybody has their own rights. And to have that kind of discussion in order for people to understand the root cause of some of the violence and aggression that is being directed towards women, and then to transition from that into the broader discourse of sexual violence and allow the community to openly discuss it and understand how it does destroy the woman as an individual. And so just to begin to understand that. And so to approach it even legally in that way, and not to be embarrassed about discussing it and addressing it. That's one. The second issue is to, I guess the easier road, not so easy though, is to address duty bearers. And whilst the community is allowed perhaps to take a longer time to come round to have their values clarified, the state cannot have that kind of attitude. And so to engage dramatically and aggressively with the state in order to ensure that the government does its duty and prioritize women's rights as key, sexual violence as key, and to align resources and departments on the same issues and to respond, so that a prosecutor cannot conduct himself bringing to the office personal feeling and regard to the case. And so the law needs to be implemented as the law, and the state needs to make sure that its officers and persons who carry themselves as representatives of the state need to uphold it in that particular fashion. And then lastly, I would think we as non-state actors need to be continually vigilant and hold the state to account and not step back. I mean, I like what Tamar has said, which is bringing these discussions of accountability to different accountability platforms. So if the state fails, then you will bring them before UN platforms. In my case, before the African Union, we've got we have the African Commission, we've got the African Committee of Experts on the Rights of the Child, we have the African Court, we have the East African Court, we've got the ECOWAS Court. So there are different regional and international platforms which can result in the state being held to account. So we as non-state actors need not step back. We need to step on the gas, if you will.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to thank both you, Tamar, and Judy for taking the time to not only educate us in what you are seeing on the ground in both of your respective areas, but also to talk to us about the realities and the challenges that we are all facing when we are talking about sexual violence and what women are experiencing. I want to encourage anybody that listens to this or is listening to this now and in the future to really take a look at the work that Equality Now is doing. We have linked in the chat the new report that Tamar had referenced that Equality Now has put out for the 15-country kind of map of what rape consent laws look like across those 15 countries. If you do have any follow-up questions for Tamar and or Judy, please don't hesitate to leave them in the Facebook chat box, and we will send it to them. Thank you so much, Tamar and Judy, for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to just end by saying to everybody that's able to join us right now and then also watch us in the future, that we are continuing the 5 actions to end gender-based violence. This webinar, this last webinar for us for the law and sexual violence in partnership with Equality Now, I hope that you have learned as much as we have in terms of what the realities in regards to sexual violence are across the world. I think it's so incredibly important that we remember that there are many barriers to justice in talking about sexual violence, which is one of the reasons why we at Women's March Global wanted to do this mini course. In the next month, what you will see from us is a focus on our 22 to 22 campaign. So 5 days ago, it was March 22nd, which was World Water Day. And in April 22nd, that is World Earth Day. Over the next 30 days, you will see profiles from us on women who are working to fight against climate change, women who are working to fight to protect water around the world, Indigenous water protectors, people who are really concerned about the fact that we are running out of water. So please check out those profiles on Instagram and on Medium as they go up, and continue to support us. Share this video, like our Twitter page and our Facebook page, and we will continue to bring you actions that you can take around gender-based violence and how you can continue to have these discussions in your communities. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.